Racist neighbor calls cops on Muslim family, then faces instant justice. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun glowed a soft amber as it sank below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the quiet suburban neighborhood. Children's laughter echoed faintly as they played in their yards, neighbors waved cheerfully to each other, and sprinklers sent arcs of water glistening into the air. On the surface, everything looked picture-perfect, row after row of tidy houses, pristine lawns and flower beds bursting with color. At the end of the street, Fatima stepped into her front yard, adjusting the blue hijab draped gracefully around her head. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as she surveyed her home with quiet pride. The house wasn't the largest on the block, nor was it flashy, but it was theirs, modest, well-kept, and filled with love. She had tended to every rose bush lining the pathway herself, and the faint smell of lavender from her garden wafted through the air. Her 3 boys, Yusuf, Kareem, and Amir, chased each other in circles, their laughter sharp and bright, the kind of sound that made her heart swell. Ibrahim, her husband, stood in the garage, carefully tuning up an old bicycle for Amir. His brow furrowed as he worked, sleeves rolled up, grease smudged across his knuckles. The peaceful rhythm of their evening was one they cherished. "Baba," Amir called, breathless from running. "Is my bike ready yet?" "Almost," Ibrahim replied, his deep voice carrying warmth. "Patience, little one." Fatima smiled to herself, watching the boys play. She felt a deep sense of contentment in this life they'd built, far from the chaos of the city where they'd once lived, where noise and uncertainty followed their every step. This was what they had worked so hard for: a safe home, a quiet neighborhood, a fresh start. But that quiet was about to shatter. Across the street, Mrs. Sullivan, known to most as Karen despite it not being her real name, peered out of her window, her face twisted into a scowl. She'd lived on this street for over 2 decades, and in her mind she had an unspoken authority over it. When Fatima and her family had moved in months ago, she had made her feelings clear without saying much at all. Her icy stares, stiff posture, and curt nods whenever they passed each other spoke volumes. And now, as she watched the family laughing and enjoying their evening, something inside her snapped. "They don't belong here," she muttered to herself, her lip curling. "I don't trust them. There's something off about them." Her fingers hovered over her phone for a moment before she snatched it up and dialed. Fatima didn't notice the patrol car creeping slowly down the street until the reflection of flashing blue and red lights caught her eye. At first she thought little of it, perhaps an officer on routine patrol. But as the car stopped in front of her driveway, her smile faltered. "Boys," she said softly, her voice calm but firm, "stay close to me." Ibrahim, wiping his hands on a rag, looked up just as the officer stepped out of the car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a crisp uniform with mirrored sunglasses perched on his nose. His expression was unreadable as he approached the family. Fatima exchanged a glance with Ibrahim, her pulse quickening. "Good evening," Ibrahim said politely, stepping forward. "Can we help you, officer?" The officer stopped a few feet away, his hand resting casually on his belt. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area," he said, his voice even. "Mind telling me what you're up to?" "Suspicious activity?" Fatima repeated, confused. I'm fixing my son's bike," Ibrahim interrupted gently, stepping in front of his wife and children. His posture was relaxed but protective, his tone respectful. "Is something wrong?" The officer glanced toward the boys, still huddled close to their mother, then at Fatima herself. The way his gaze lingered made her stomach turn. "We got a complaint," the officer said again, his words deliberate this time, "about this household." Fatima felt heat rising in her chest. Her hands clenched at her sides as she struggled to keep her voice steady. "A complaint? About what?" The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the house across the street, where Mrs. Sullivan stood on her porch, arms crossed over her chest and a smug expression on her face. "Your neighbor called us," the officer finally admitted. "She said you've been behaving suspiciously. That you're disturbing the peace." Fatima's eyebrows shot up in disbelief. "Disturbing the peace?" she echoed. "We haven't done anything wrong. I'm going to need to see some ID," the officer interrupted, his voice firm now. Ibrahim's jaw tightened, though he remained calm. "Officer, with all due respect, we haven't broken any laws. Why do you need our identification?" The officer shifted his weight, clearly irritated by the question. "It's a simple request, sir. Just show me your ID and we can clear this up quickly. Fatima looked toward Mrs. Sullivan again, whose smirk had grown wider. It was as if she were enjoying the scene playing out before her. Unbelievable, Ibrahim muttered under his breath as he reached for his wallet. Fatima could feel the boys clinging to her tighter now. Kareem looked up at her with wide, worried eyes. Mama, he whispered, what's happening? Nothing, Habibi, she said, brushing his hair back gently. Everything is fine. But her voice wavered, betraying her own unease. The exchange felt like it dragged on forever. The officer inspected Ibrahim's ID as if searching for something, anything, to justify his presence. Meanwhile, Mrs. Sullivan stayed rooted to her spot across the street, watching like a hawk. You're wasting your time, officer, Fatima finally said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. We haven't done anything suspicious or illegal. If you want proof, ask any other neighbor here. She gestured toward the houses nearby, where a few people had begun peeking out their windows, drawn by the flashing lights and tension in the air. The officer lowered Ibrahim's ID and hesitated. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, and the family's calm demeanor offered nothing to support the complaint. Still, he lingered as if unsure how to proceed. Fatima took a step forward, her voice sharper now. We have lived here for months without causing anyone trouble. My children play outside like everyone else's. My husband fixes bikes. I garden. Is that the crime we're guilty of? The officer shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could respond, a voice rang out from behind him. Everything okay here? Another man stepped onto the scene. One of their neighbors, Mr. Thompson, a retired teacher with a warm smile and an easygoing demeanor. He approached the family with a concerned expression, glancing between the officer and Ibrahim. Officer, I live 2 houses down, Mr. Thompson said, his tone polite but firm. This family is lovely. I've never seen them do anything but mind their own business. What exactly is the issue here? The officer turned slightly, clearly caught off guard. We received a call. From her? Mr. Thompson cut in, jerking his head toward Mrs. Sullivan. Officer, with all due respect, Karen over there calls you guys for anything and everything. She's reported the mailman before. She's harassed the kids playing basketball last summer. This isn't the first time. Fatima's heart lifted slightly at the man's defense. She caught Ibrahim's eye and he nodded subtly, a flicker of relief crossing his face. The officer sighed, clearly conflicted now. He turned back to Ibrahim, handing him the ID. Sorry for the inconvenience, he muttered, though his tone lacked sincerity. Ibrahim nodded curtly. Next time, maybe ask a few questions before assuming we're guilty of something. Fatima's shoulders sagged with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She ushered her boys inside, her voice soft but firm. Come, children. It's time to go in. As she passed by Mrs. Sullivan's house, she met the woman's gaze directly. For the first time, Mrs. Sullivan looked away. Inside the house, the atmosphere was heavy. The boys were unusually quiet as they sat around the living room, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Ibrahim sat in his favorite armchair, rubbing his temples, his face taut with frustration. Fatima moved to the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she poured glasses of water. The familiar sound of the faucet running grounded her, but her thoughts continued to swirl. That woman, Ibrahim muttered finally, breaking the silence. That woman has nothing better to do than spread poison. Fatima carried the glasses of water into the living room, setting them down on the table. She kept her voice calm for the boys' sake, though every word felt like it was lined with thorns. We knew there would be people like her, she said, glancing at Ibrahim. But we also knew we could handle them. Amir, the youngest, looked up at her with big, earnest eyes. Mama, why did the police come? Did we do something bad? The question hit her like a punch to the stomach. She sat down next to him, pulling him close and brushing her hand gently over his hair. No, Habibi, she said softly. We didn't do anything wrong. Sometimes, people make mistakes. They don't understand us, so they get scared and they act unfairly. But you didn't do anything bad. Do you understand? Amir nodded slowly, though the crease in his brow didn't disappear. Kareem, the middle child, chimed in, his voice sharp with frustration. It's not fair. We were just playing outside. Why does she hate us? Fatima exchanged a glance with Ibrahim. He nodded, giving her permission to speak. Not everyone will be kind, Kareem, she said gently. Some people see someone different and decide to judge them without knowing who they are. That's what Mrs. Sullivan did tonight. But why us? Kareem pressed. We didn't do anything to her. Fatima took a deep breath, steadying herself. Because sometimes when people see someone wearing a hijab or someone who speaks another language or someone with skin that's a little darker, they decide we don't belong. It's wrong, Kareem, but it's what happens. The boys fell silent again, each digesting her words in their own way. Listen to me, Ibrahim said, sitting up straighter now. His voice was firm but kind, a voice that carried strength. This is our home. We worked hard for it. We deserve to be here just like anyone else. And no matter what anyone says, we will hold our heads high. Understand? The boys nodded, their father's words filling the room with a quiet determination. Fatima smiled faintly, though her heart still ached for them. Now go wash up for dinner, she said softly, ushering them away. As the boys shuffled out of the room, she turned to Ibrahim. This won't stop her, she said quietly. You know that, don't you? Ibrahim's jaw clenched. I know. The next morning, Fatima woke early. The sun had barely risen, but the house was already filled with the comforting smells of breakfast. She moved through the kitchen with practiced ease, flipping eggs, slicing bread and brewing tea. The familiar routine brought her a sense of calm, a way to push back against the lingering unease from the night before. Ibrahim joined her soon after, his hair still damp from the shower. You didn't sleep much, he said, studying her face. I couldn't, she admitted, handing him a plate of food. I kept thinking about what happened. He sighed, sitting down at the table. It's over now, Fatima. She embarrassed herself more than anything. Is it over though? She asked, leaning against the counter. People saw what happened. They saw the police in our driveway. Do you think they'll see it for what it was? Or will they start to wonder if we did something wrong? Ibrahim didn't have an answer. He simply stared down at his plate, his shoulders heavy. Across the street, Mrs. Sullivan was already up and about. She stood on her porch with a cup of coffee in her hand, watching the neighborhood like a hawk. Her eyes lingered on Fatima's house, narrowing slightly as she took a slow sip. She hadn't expected the police to leave so quickly the night before. She had assumed they'd search the house, question the family more thoroughly, maybe even find something. After all, in her mind, they didn't belong there. It didn't matter that they were quiet, that their children were polite, that Ibrahim worked hard and Fatima kept their yard immaculate. It didn't matter because she had decided they were different, and that was enough. Morning, Karen, a voice called out, breaking her thoughts. She turned to see Mr. Thompson walking his dog along the sidewalk. He gave her a polite nod, though there was a glimmer of something sharper in his expression. Morning, she replied curtly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Mr. Thompson paused for a moment, looking toward Fatima's house before turning back to Mrs. Sullivan. Quite a scene you caused last night, he said casually. Mrs. Sullivan bristled. I was just doing my duty as a concerned neighbor. Concerned? Mr. Thompson's voice held a hint of disbelief. About what, exactly? A family fixing a bike? Kids playing in their yard? That's what we call suspicious these days? Mrs. Sullivan's face flushed. I know what I saw, she snapped. Do you? Mr. Thompson replied, his tone turning sharper now. Or did you just see what you wanted to see? She opened her mouth to respond, but he didn't give her the chance. You know, Karen, this neighborhood used to be better than this. We looked out for each other. We didn't look for reasons to tear each other down. He tugged lightly on his dog's leash, signaling the end of the conversation. Maybe you should think about that. Mrs. Sullivan watched him walk away, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. For the next few days, the family did their best to move on. The boys played in the backyard instead of out front. Ibrahim kept himself busy in the garage. Fatima spent hours in her garden, her hands buried in the soil as she worked in silence. But the weight of what happened lingered. They could feel it in the glances they received from passing cars, in the way some neighbors looked at them now with hesitation or doubt. It was as though a shadow had fallen over their home, one they couldn't quite shake. One afternoon, Fatima knelt beside a rose bush, pruning its branches with quiet focus. She barely noticed the sound of footsteps until a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Mrs. Sullivan standing at the edge of her yard, arms crossed. Fatima froze for a moment, then straightened slowly. Can I help you? She asked, her voice steady. Mrs. Sullivan's expression was cold, her eyes narrowing slightly. You're making quite the fuss, you know, she said. People are talking. Fatima felt her hands clench around the pruning shears. She forced herself to stay calm. We didn't cause any fuss, she said. You did? Mrs. Sullivan's lips curled into a sneer. I called the police for a reason. You people don't belong here. There it was. The truth, ugly and bare. Fatima stared at her for a long moment, feeling a surge of anger rise in her chest. But she didn't let it show. Instead, she smiled faintly, a small, defiant smile that seemed to throw Mrs. Sullivan off balance. "This is our home," Fatima said softly. "Whether you like it or not." Mrs. Sullivan opened her mouth to respond, but Fatima turned her back on her, returning to her roses without another word. Fatima's hands worked the soil with deliberate calm as Mrs. Sullivan stood there, momentarily stunned by the quiet defiance in Fatima's words. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. The only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the faint hum of a lawn mower somewhere down the block. Finally, Mrs. Sullivan let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "People like you don't understand, do you? This neighborhood used to be safe. It used to have standards." Fatima didn't look up. Her voice was steady, almost soft. "What you mean is that this neighborhood used to look like you?" The words hit harder than any raised voice ever could. Mrs. Sullivan stiffened, her face turning red. "Excuse me?" Fatima rose to her feet, brushing dirt from her gloves as she turned to face the woman fully. "You heard me," she said, her voice unshaken. "You don't care about safety or standards, Mrs. Sullivan. You care about sameness. You see a family like mine with different skin, different clothes, a different way of life, and it frightens you. So you make up stories in your head, stories where we're the villains. But that doesn't make them true." Mrs. Sullivan's mouth opened, then closed again as if she were searching for a retort. None came. Fatima turned back to her roses. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Mrs. Sullivan stood there a moment longer, glaring at the back of Fatima's head. Finally, she spun on her heel and stalked back across the street. Fatima waited until she heard the woman's front door slam shut before letting out a long breath. Her hands still trembled, but it wasn't fear that made them shake, it was anger. A deep, simmering anger that she couldn't let spill over. Not now. Not in front of her boys. Inside the house, Ibrahim watched Fatima from the window. He'd seen the whole exchange, though he couldn't hear what was said. When she finally came inside, he handed her a glass of water without a word. "Thank you," she murmured, taking it gratefully. She sank into a chair at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. "What did she say?" Ibrahim asked finally, his voice calm but tight. Fatima hesitated. She didn't want to repeat Mrs. Sullivan's hateful words, not because Ibrahim couldn't handle them, but because saying them out loud would give them weight they didn't deserve. "Nothing worth repeating," she said instead, shaking her head. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Ibrahim said softly, sitting across from her. "It matters because it keeps happening. And if we pretend it doesn't, she'll think she's won." Fatima sighed, rubbing her temples. "What do you want me to do? Go knock on her door and shout at her?" "That's what she wants, Ibrahim. She wants us to lose our dignity. She wants to feel like she's in control." Ibrahim nodded slowly, understanding her point. "Maybe. But she doesn't get to decide who belongs here." Fatima looked at him, her eyes softening. "No, she doesn't." For a while they sat in silence. Outside, the boys were playing in the backyard, their laughter muffled by the thick walls of the house. The sound reminded Fatima why they had chosen this place. Why they had worked so hard to build a life here. "We'll figure it out," Ibrahim said quietly. "We always do." Fatima smiled faintly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Yes, we will." The next few days were quiet, but the tension lingered like a storm cloud over the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors seemed to avoid eye contact with Fatima and Ibrahim now, as if unsure of where they stood. Others went out of their way to be kind. A smile here, a wave there, as though trying to silently show their support. Mr. Thompson, in particular, made a point of stopping by whenever he saw Ibrahim in the garage. "How's that bike coming along?" he asked one afternoon, leaning on the fence with his hands tucked into his pockets. Ibrahim smiled faintly, wiping grease from his hands. "Almost done. Amir will be riding it in no time." Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. Good. "You know, I'm sorry about what happened the other night. Some people..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Some people don't know how to mind their own business." Ibrahim glanced up at him, his smile fading slightly. "It's not just about minding business, Mr. Thompson. It's about respect." Mr. Thompson's expression turned serious. "You're right. It is. And I want you to know, not everyone here thinks like her. Plenty of us are glad to have you and your family here." "Thank you," Ibrahim said quietly. "It's the truth," Mr. Thompson replied. He hesitated for a moment, then added, "And if you ever need someone to back you up, I'm right across the street." Ibrahim nodded, grateful for the man's kindness. "That means a lot." Unfortunately, not everyone in the neighborhood shared Mr. Thompson's sense of fairness. It started small. A trash can knocked over in the middle of the night. A bag of fertilizer spilled across the driveway. At first, Fatima and Ibrahim chalked it up to accidents, random annoyances that could happen to anyone. But as the days passed, the incidents became harder to ignore. One morning, Fatima opened the mailbox to find it stuffed with crumpled flyers. Flyers for a local neighborhood watch group that she'd never heard of before. Scrawled across the top of one flyer in thick black ink were the words, "We're watching you." Fatima's heart stopped. She stood there for a moment, staring at the paper in her hands, the words burning into her mind. Then she crumpled it up and shoved it into her pocket, glancing around the street. It was empty. Quiet. Too quiet. Inside, she found Ibrahim at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as he read the news on his phone. He looked up as she entered, immediately noticing the tension in her face. What happened? She pulled the crumpled flyer from her pocket and dropped it in front of him. Ibrahim frowned, smoothing it out with his hands. When he read the words, his expression darkened. "This has to stop," he muttered, his voice low. "It's one thing for that woman to call the police. But this is harassment. What do we do?" Fatima asked softly. Ibrahim was quiet for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists. "We call it what it is," he said finally. "We don't let them intimidate us. And we don't hide." Fatima nodded, though a knot of anxiety still twisted in her stomach. That evening, Ibrahim made a point of staying outside, working on the bike in plain view. He wanted them to see him, to know that he wasn't afraid. Fatima sat on the porch, a book in her lap, though she wasn't reading it. She was watching. Waiting. Across the street, Mrs. Sullivan peeked out from behind her curtains, her eyes narrowed as she watched them. Fatima met her gaze through the window and held it. For once, Mrs. Sullivan was the one who looked away first. The next day, Ibrahim called a neighborhood meeting. He and Fatima didn't have many close relationships in the community, but they weren't about to let the whispering continue unchecked. They invited every neighbor on the block, placing polite invitations in mailboxes and handing a few out in person. The note was simple. "Please join us at our home to discuss community safety and respect. We believe every voice deserves to be heard." The reaction was mixed. Some neighbors accepted the invitation readily, offering warm smiles and promises to attend. Others hesitated, murmuring excuses about prior commitments. Mrs. Sullivan, of course, made her opinion known loudly and clearly. "Community safety?" she scoffed to anyone who would listen. "They're the ones we need to be safe from." But despite her protests, the meeting went ahead as planned. Fatima and Ibrahim prepared carefully, setting up chairs in the living room and brewing fresh tea. They wanted their neighbors to feel welcome, not accused, not attacked, but welcome. When the time came, a handful of neighbors trickled in, Mr. Thompson among them, along with a few others Fatima recognized from passing waves and polite small talk. They smiled awkwardly as they took their seats, clearly unsure of what to expect. "Thank you all for coming," Ibrahim said, standing at the front of the room. "We wanted to talk to you today because we know there's been some tension in the neighborhood recently. And we wanted to address it openly." Fatima nodded, adding, "We're your neighbors. We want the same things you do, a safe, peaceful place to live and raise our children. But we can't have that if we're not treated with respect." She paused, letting her words sink in. Around the room, she could see some neighbors shifting uncomfortably, while others nodded in agreement. "We understand that not everyone knows us," Ibrahim continued. "But we hope you'll take the time to get to know us, instead of listening to rumors or assumptions. This is our home just like it's yours." The room fell quiet as Ibrahim finished speaking, his words settling like dust into the stillness. Fatima scanned the faces of their neighbors, searching for signs of understanding, of empathy. Mr. Thompson nodded encouragingly, his hands clasped in his lap, but others looked less convinced. A middle-aged woman in a floral blouse sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. Next to her, an older man rubbed his chin thoughtfully, avoiding eye contact. The silence stretched for a beat too long before Mr. Thompson spoke up, his voice breaking the tension. "I think it's brave of you both to call this meeting. A lot of people would have just put their heads down and hoped the trouble went away. But you're right. This is your home and you deserve to feel safe in it." Ibrahim nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. That means a lot." The older man who had been rubbing his chin, Mr. Harper, the retired accountant who lived 2 doors down, cleared his throat. "Look, I'll be honest," he began, his voice gravelly and low. "When the police came last week, I didn't know what to think. Rumors fly in neighborhoods like this, you know? And when someone stirs up trouble..." He glanced toward the window as if acknowledging Mrs. Sullivan without saying her name. It's easy to let suspicion take root. Fatima felt her stomach twist. She didn't like hearing that neighbors, people she and Ibrahim had smiled at for months, had doubted them. But there was something in Mr. Harper's tone that softened the sting. He looked up at Ibrahim, his gaze steady now. But hearing you speak, I realize we've all been unfair. You're good people. I can see that now. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The woman in the floral blouse uncrossed her arms, shifting in her seat as if she, too, was reconsidering her position. I just don't understand why Mrs. Sullivan would do something like that, another woman, younger and softer spoken, said from the back of the room. You've never bothered anyone. I see you playing with your kids, working in the yard. You're better neighbors than most. Fatima smiled faintly, though the warmth didn't reach her eyes. Thank you. But it's not just about us. What happened here isn't new. It's something families like ours deal with far too often. She paused, choosing her words carefully. When someone decides we don't belong without knowing anything about us, it puts us in danger. All it takes is one call, one false accusation to change everything. The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Fatima could see it in their faces, the slow dawning realization of what she meant. Ibrahim stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. We're not asking for special treatment. All we want is to be treated like anyone else. To feel safe in our own home. To know that our children can play outside without someone calling the police on them. He looked around the room, meeting each person's gaze. That shouldn't be too much to ask. It's not, Mr. Thompson said quietly. It's really not, someone else murmured. For the first time in days, Fatima felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, just the first few rays of light breaking through the storm, but it was something. When the meeting ended, neighbors lingered longer than Fatima expected. Some approached her and Ibrahim to shake their hands or offer quiet words of apology. I didn't realize, one woman admitted, her cheeks flushed. I'm so sorry for doubting you. It's all right, Fatima replied softly. Thank you for coming. It means a lot. Others promised to keep an eye out, to support them if anything like this happened again. Mr. Thompson was the last to leave, giving Ibrahim a firm handshake at the door. You've got allies here, he said. Don't forget that. As the neighbors filed out and the house finally grew quiet, Fatima sank onto the couch, exhaling a long breath. Ibrahim sat beside her, resting his hand on her shoulder. That went better than I expected, he said. Fatima nodded. Maybe. But I still don't trust her to stop. Ibrahim's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't argue. We'll be ready if she tries anything else. Sure enough, Mrs. Sullivan's bitterness didn't end with the meeting. She had watched the steady stream of neighbors leaving Fatima and Ibrahim's house with growing resentment, her lips pressed into a thin line. That evening, she sat on her porch with a glass of wine in hand, glaring at the lights still glowing in their windows. Unbelievable, she muttered to herself. They're turning everyone against me. Me, the one who's been here for 20 years. Her frustration festered over the next few days. She complained loudly to anyone who would listen, spinning tales of suspicious behavior and ungrateful newcomers who were poisoning the neighborhood. Some neighbors listened politely and then walked away, but others began to avoid her altogether. The shift was subtle at first. People stopped waving when they saw her. The couple who used to chat with her during their evening walks now crossed the street when they passed her house. Even the mailman who had once greeted her with a cheerful good morning, barely mumbled a hello now. Mrs. Sullivan noticed it all and it made her furious. They'll see, she muttered one night, pacing her living room. They'll see I was right. 2 weeks later, Ibrahim was walking the boys home from school when he noticed a police car parked in front of their house. His heart sank, his steps quickening as he glanced down at the boys. Go inside, he said gently, handing Yusuf the house key. Stay together, all right? What's happening, Baba? Kareem asked, his voice small. Nothing, Ibrahim said, forcing a smile. Just go inside. I'll be right there. The boys hesitated, but they obeyed, running up the front steps and disappearing into the house. Ibrahim approached the officer standing at the edge of the driveway, his posture tense but polite. Is something wrong, officer? The man turned to face him, his expression neutral. We received another call about your property, sir. Your neighbor reported seeing suspicious packages being delivered here. Ibrahim's jaw tightened. Suspicious packages? You mean my son's birthday gifts? The officer raised an eyebrow. Birthday gifts? Ibrahim gestured toward the porch, where a stack of boxes sat waiting to be brought inside. It's my son's birthday tomorrow. Those are his presents. The officer glanced at the boxes, clearly unsure of how to respond. Finally he sighed. Look sir, I'm just following up on the call. It's probably nothing but we had to check. Ibrahim nodded stiffly, though his patience was wearing thin. You've checked. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'd like to go inside and spend time with my family. The officer hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded. Of course. Have a good day, sir. As the police car pulled away, Ibrahim turned to see Fatima standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of anger and exhaustion. Again? She asked softly. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. Again? She stepped aside to let him into the house, her voice trembling as she spoke. This has to stop, Ibrahim. She's trying to make our lives miserable. She won't win, Ibrahim said firmly, setting the boxes down on the kitchen table. She can call the police as many times as she wants, but she won't drive us out of here. Fatima pressed her hands to her face, drawing a deep breath before letting it out slowly. It's not just about us. What if the boys had been home alone? What if... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Ibrahim pulled her into a gentle embrace, his voice softening. We'll figure this out. I promise. That night, Fatima couldn't sleep. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She kept replaying the moment she'd seen the police car, her heart dropping, the fear bubbling in her chest. What if next time they didn't believe them? What if next time things escalated? She turned to look at Ibrahim, who was sleeping soundly beside her. He carried so much weight on his shoulders already, and yet he never faltered. His strength was what kept them all standing. But Fatima couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And she was right. The next morning, Fatima stood in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea as the first rays of sunlight crept in through the window. The night's restless sleep still clung to her, making her limbs feel heavy. She watched the street outside, empty and quiet except for a few early risers walking their dogs or jogging. A sense of dread gnawed at her, even in the stillness. She couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Ibrahim entered the kitchen, yawning as he rolled his shoulders. He noticed the dark circles under Fatima's eyes and frowned. You didn't sleep again? I couldn't, she admitted softly. I keep thinking about the boys, about what might happen next. What if she pushes this further? Ibrahim moved to stand beside her, gently resting a hand on her back. She's trying to wear us down, he said firmly. That's what people like her do. But she doesn't know who she's dealing with. We won't let her win. Fatima smiled faintly at his determination, but it didn't fully ease her worries. How long can we keep doing this, Ibrahim? The police, the harassment, the looks, she sighed. We're fighting a battle we didn't ask for. He turned her gently so she faced him. We're fighting it because it matters, he said. For the boys. For us. For anyone who comes after us. If we back down now, she'll think she can do this to anyone. Fatima nodded slowly, feeling the truth in his words, even if the weight of it was hard to bear. You're right, she said quietly. We can't back down. Never, Ibrahim replied, kissing her forehead. Later that day, while Ibrahim was at work and the boys were at school, Fatima sat in the living room reading when she heard a loud thud outside. She froze for a moment, her heart jumping in her chest, before carefully standing and peeking through the front curtains. Her breath caught in her throat. A large, crude spray-painted word stretched across the sidewalk in front of their house. Leave? Fatima's hands shook as she stared at the bright red letters. The word felt like a scream in the quiet street, violent and unrelenting. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. She grabbed her phone and stepped outside, her heart hammering in her chest. She took a photo of the vandalism, documenting it before it could be washed away. Then she turned, slowly surveying the street. It was empty, whoever had done it was long gone. But across the road, Mrs. Sullivan's curtains twitched. Fatima's eyes narrowed. When Ibrahim came home that evening, he found her kneeling on the sidewalk with a scrub brush, her hands raw as she worked to scrub the paint away. Fatima, he called, rushing to her side. What are you doing? What does it look like? She replied, her voice trembling with anger. I'm cleaning. He knelt beside her, his gaze falling on the partially scrubbed letters. His face darkened, his jaw tightening. Who did this? Who do you think? Fatima snapped, gesturing toward Mrs. Sullivan's house. She's not going to stop, Ibrahim. She'll keep pushing us until we leave or until something terrible happens. Ibrahim placed a firm hand on hers, stopping her scrubbing. No, he said quietly but forcefully. We won't let her win. You hear me? We will not let her do this to us. She looked up at him, tears pooling in her eyes. But what do? The police didn't help last time. They won't do anything now. We make them listen, Ibrahim said, his voice calm but filled with steel. This isn't just harassment anymore. It's a hate crime. Fatima wiped the back of her hand across her face, smearing dirt across her cheek. She stared at him for a moment, searching his face for answers. Finally she nodded. Okay, she whispered. We'll fight back. The next morning, Ibrahim took the photos Fatima had taken and drove straight to the police station. Fatima stayed home with the boys, her nerves frayed as she waited for his call. When her phone finally buzzed, she answered immediately. What did they say? They're taking it seriously, Ibrahim said. At least more seriously than last time. They said they'd send someone out to investigate. Fatima let out a shaky breath, relief and doubt warring within her. Do you think they'll actually do anything? They will, Ibrahim replied firmly. They have to. But Fatima wasn't sure. She looked out the window again, her gaze landing on the sidewalk where faint traces of red still clung to the concrete. Her stomach turned. That afternoon, 2 police officers arrived to take a statement from Ibrahim and Fatima. The boys were sent to their rooms, but Fatima could hear their whispered voices drifting down the hallway as they tried to listen in. The officers stood in the living room, notebooks in hand as Ibrahim spoke. We've dealt with harassment from this neighbor for weeks now, he said calmly. She's called the police on us with false accusations, she spread rumors, and now this. He handed over the photos Fatima had taken of the graffiti. One of the officers, a young man with kind eyes, frowned as he looked at the image. That's pretty clear, he said. And you believe your neighbor did this? Who else would it be? Ibrahim replied. She's the only one who's harassed us like this. She's made it very clear she doesn't want us here. The older officer jotted something down in his notebook, his expression unreadable. We'll talk to her, he said finally. And we'll file this as vandalism. You said you've had prior incidents? Yes, Fatima said, her voice sharp. The false police call. The flyers in our mailbox. The way she stares at us, always watching. The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner. Understood. We'll make a note of everything. If you notice anything else, anything at all, let us know immediately. Fatima nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the officers still weren't taking it as seriously as they should. Thank you, Ibrahim said, his tone clipped but polite. The officers left soon after, promising to speak with Mrs. Sullivan. Fatima watched from the window as they crossed the street and knocked on her door. Mrs. Sullivan answered after a moment, feigning surprise as they spoke to her. She gestured dramatically, pointing toward Fatima and Ibrahim's house, her face a mask of innocence. Fatima's hands curled into fists at her sides. Look at her, she muttered. She's lying through her teeth. Ibrahim placed a hand on her shoulder. Let them handle it, Fatima. She turned to him, her expression tight. And what if they don't? What if she just gets away with it? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Over the next few days there was no more vandalism, no police visits, no flyers. It was almost too quiet, and Fatima couldn't decide if that was better or worse. The boys seemed to sense the change. They played in the backyard more than ever, avoiding the front of the house. Yusuf, the oldest, had started double-checking the locks before bed each night. Kareem slept with the hallway light on. One evening, as Fatima tucked Amir into bed, he whispered a question that made her chest ache. Mama, do we have to leave? She froze, smoothing the blanket over his small body. No, Habibi. This is our home. But what if the bad people come back? She swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Then we'll be brave. We'll face them together. Amir stared at her for a long moment, his young eyes far too wise. Okay, Mama, he said finally. I'll be brave. Fatima kissed his forehead, her heart breaking for him. That night, as she and Ibrahim sat together on the couch, Fatima said quietly, we need to do more. He looked at her, brows furrowing. What do you mean? We need to tell people what's happening, she said. We can't just keep this to ourselves. If we don't speak up, she'll think she's won. And the next time someone like her does this, it might be worse. Ibrahim nodded slowly, understanding her point. What are you thinking? We start with the neighbors, Fatima said. The ones who came to the meeting. We tell them what's happened since then. And if that doesn't work, we go bigger. Ibrahim looked at her, pride shining in his eyes. You're stronger than you know, Fatima. She smiled faintly. We have to be strong. For the boys. For ourselves. For everyone who's watching. The next morning, Fatima woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The events of the past weeks had left her shaken, but something inside her had hardened. She wouldn't let fear win. As she moved about the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the boys, she rehearsed what she would say to their neighbors. Ibrahim joined her, still sleepy but already sensing her determination. "You're planning something?" he said as he poured himself a cup of coffee. Fatima nodded. "I'm going to speak to the neighbors again. The ones who supported us at the meeting. If we don't show them what's really happening, they'll only hear her version of the story." Ibrahim regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll come with you. We'll do it together." By the time the boys had left for school, Fatima and Ibrahim had a plan. They would start with Mr. Thompson. He had already proven to be an ally, and then move on to the others. They didn't want to spread hate or cause more tension in the neighborhood, but they needed people to see what was happening. They needed people to understand. Their first stop was Mr. Thompson's house. He answered the door with a warm smile, stepping aside to let them in. "Good to see you both," he said, gesturing toward the couch. "What's on your minds?" Fatima wasted no time. She handed him a printed photo of the graffiti from their sidewalk, the ugly red letters spelling out "Leave." Mr. Thompson's smile faded as he stared at the image, his brow furrowing. "Who did this?" he asked, though they all knew the answer. "We can't prove it," Ibrahim said calmly. "But we know who's been harassing us. And we know she won't stop unless people hold her accountable." Mr. Thompson looked up at them, his expression serious. "That's low. Even for her." He shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line. "This isn't just petty nonsense anymore. It's targeted. It's hateful." Fatima nodded. "That's why we're here. We need your help, Mr. Thompson. We need people to see what's happening so she doesn't get away with it." "You've got my support," he said firmly. "And I'll talk to some of the others too. People need to know the truth." Relief flooded Fatima's chest. "Thank you," she said softly. Mr. Thompson nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Don't let her scare you off. You belong here." Over the next few days, Fatima and Ibrahim visited several of their neighbors. Some were hesitant to get involved, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but others offered their quiet support. Mrs. Gupta, who lived next door, was especially kind. "I saw the police at your house again," she said, shaking her head. "I wondered what had happened. I'm so sorry you're dealing with this. It's not right." "It's not," Fatima agreed. "But we're not going to let it break us." Mrs. Gupta squeezed her hand. "If there's anything I can do to help, just let me know." Fatima left each conversation feeling a little lighter. The neighbors who believed in them, who supported them, reminded her that Mrs. Sullivan's hatred didn't define the entire community. There was kindness here too. But Mrs. Sullivan wasn't finished. Late one evening, as Fatima sat on the couch folding laundry, the doorbell rang. She frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 9 p.m., too late for a casual visit. Ibrahim, who had been reading nearby, stood and moved to the door, his expression wary. "Who is it?" he called out. "It's the police," a voice replied from outside. Fatima's heart sank. She set the laundry aside and joined Ibrahim at the door as he opened it. Two officers stood on the porch, their faces serious. "Sorry to bother you so late," one of them said. "We received another call about this property. Your neighbor reported seeing unusual activity near your garage." Fatima's hands curled into fists. "Unusual activity?" she repeated, her voice tight. "What does that even mean?" The officer shifted uncomfortably. "She claimed someone was sneaking around, possibly breaking in. We just need to take a look, ma'am." "This is harassment," Ibrahim said sharply. "You realize that, don't you? This woman has called you multiple times with false accusations, and now you're here again, at night, disturbing my family." The officers exchanged glances. "We understand your frustration, sir, but we still have to check." Ibrahim looked like he wanted to argue, but Fatima placed a hand on his arm. "Let them look," she said quietly. "We have nothing to hide." The officers swept their flashlights around the garage and the yard, finding nothing as Fatima knew they would. By the time they left, her anger was bubbling dangerously close to the surface. "This has to stop," she said, her voice shaking as Ibrahim closed the door behind them. "It will," Ibrahim said, though the weariness in his voice betrayed his own frustration. Fatima sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. How many more times? How many more false calls before someone does something about her? Ibrahim didn't have an answer. He sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. But Fatima wasn't satisfied with that. She didn't want to figure it out. She wanted it to end. The next day, Fatima made a decision. She sat down at the dining table with her laptop and began typing. She poured every ounce of frustration, fear, and resolve into her words. She wrote about the vandalism, the false police calls, the stares, the whispers. She wrote about her family, their hopes for a peaceful life in this neighborhood, their determination to stand tall despite the hatred they faced. She ended with a powerful statement: "We will not leave. We will not hide. This is our home and we will fight for it." When she finished, she read the post aloud to Ibrahim. His eyes shone with pride as he listened. "It's perfect," he said. Fatima posted the message on the neighborhood Facebook group, attaching the photo of the graffiti for everyone to see. Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Comments started flooding in. "This is awful. I'm so sorry this happened to your family. I can't believe someone would do this. You don't deserve this kind of treatment. This makes me so angry. That woman should be ashamed of herself." Fatima felt a flicker of hope as the support poured in. But as expected, there were also comments defending Mrs. Sullivan. People who claimed she was just being cautious or that the family was making a big deal out of nothing. One comment stood out though, and it came from Mrs. Sullivan herself. Maybe if they didn't act so suspicious all the time, people wouldn't feel the need to call the police. Just saying. Fatima's hands trembled as she read the words. Her first instinct was to fire back, but Ibrahim stopped her. "Don't give her the satisfaction," he said. "People can see her for who she really is now. Let her words speak for themselves." And he was right. Almost immediately, others jumped to their defense. "This comment is disgusting. You should be ashamed of yourself. They haven't done anything suspicious. You're just looking for reasons to hate. Enough is enough, Karen. Leave them alone." The tide was turning. The following day, a knock on the door startled Fatima. She opened it to find Mr. Thompson standing there, holding a large can of paint and a brush. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. He smiled. "I figured you might need some help covering up that graffiti. I'm no artist, but I can paint over a sidewalk." Fatima felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me," Mr. Thompson replied. "You're my neighbors. And neighbors look out for each other." As he worked to cover the last traces of the hateful word, other neighbors began to gather, watching him with curiosity. Slowly, a few of them joined in, sweeping the sidewalk, trimming Fatima's roses, offering quiet words of encouragement. Mrs. Sullivan watched from her porch, her face a mask of fury. But for the first time, it wasn't Fatima and Ibrahim who felt out of place. It was her. For the first time in weeks, Fatima felt something shift. As Mr. Thompson painted over the graffiti and other neighbors pitched in, the weight on her chest seemed to lift, if only slightly. The quiet solidarity of those who showed up, a broom here, a kind word there, wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was meaningful. It was proof that not everyone had chosen silence. She and Ibrahim watched from the porch, their hands clasped as the word "leave" disappeared beneath a fresh coat of white paint. It was a simple act, but it felt monumental. Mrs. Sullivan watched too, her face flushed with anger as she stood on her porch, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "She's furious," Ibrahim murmured, unable to hide the faintest trace of satisfaction in his voice. Fatima shook her head, her smile soft but resolute. "Let her be. She's losing control and she knows it." As if hearing Fatima's words, Mrs. Sullivan turned abruptly and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed down the street. A few neighbors glanced at each other and shook their heads, muttering quietly as they went back to their work. When the paint dried later that afternoon, Mr. Thompson stood back and admired his handiwork. "Good as new," he said with a proud grin, wiping his hands on a rag. "She won't win this, you know. The rest of us won't let her." Fatima's eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. For everything." He waved off her thanks with a humble shrug. "It's what neighbors do." That evening, Fatima and Ibrahim sat together in the backyard as the boys played. The sound of their laughter carried on the wind, mingling with the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves. The neighborhood, so full of tension just days ago, felt almost peaceful again. "I didn't think things could change so quickly," Fatima admitted, sipping her tea. "A week ago, I thought we were completely alone." "We weren't," Ibrahim said softly. "We just didn't know who was willing to stand with us." Fatima glanced toward the front of the house, where the faint light from Mr. Thompson's porch glowed like a beacon. "We still have a long way to go," she said. Ibrahim nodded, setting his mug down. "We do. But we're not backing down. Not now, not ever." The boys ran up to them, their faces flushed and their clothes covered in grass stains. "Mama, Baba, look," Amir shouted, holding up a tiny frog he'd caught. Fatima laughed, shaking her head. "Careful, Amir. Don't hurt it." "We won't," Yusuf said, gently cupping the frog in his hands. "We'll let him go soon." Watching her children play so freely, so full of life, Fatima felt a renewed sense of purpose. She thought of all the families like hers, families who had faced the same hatred, the same fear, and she knew that this wasn't just about her and Ibrahim anymore. This was about setting an example. About showing her boys that they didn't need to hide who they were. "This is our home," she said softly, almost to herself. "And we'll keep fighting for it." But Mrs. Sullivan wasn't ready to let go of her bitterness. She kept to herself for a while, retreating behind her curtains like a storm gathering strength. The whispers that had once been aimed at Fatima and Ibrahim were now swirling around her instead. Neighbors who had once greeted her warmly now crossed the street to avoid her, their eyes cold and disapproving. And then one afternoon her anger finally boiled over. It started with the sound of shouting. Fatima was in the garden, tending to her roses, when she heard Mrs. Sullivan's voice echoing down the street. She looked up, startled, and saw the older woman standing on her porch, yelling at a delivery driver who had parked his truck near her house. "What are you doing here?" Mrs. Sullivan demanded, her face red with anger. "You can't park there. You people think you can do whatever you want." The delivery driver, a young man with a patient expression, tried to explain. "Ma'am, I'm just dropping off a package. I'll be gone in a minute." "I don't care," she snapped. "Go back where you came from." Fatima's stomach turned. She glanced around and saw other neighbors peeking out of their homes, watching the scene unfold. Mr. Thompson stepped onto his porch, shaking his head in disgust. "That's enough, Karen," he called out, his voice loud and clear. Mrs. Sullivan whirled around, her expression stunned. "Excuse me?" "I said that's enough," Mr. Thompson repeated, walking toward her. "We're all tired of it. The shouting, the accusations, the way you treat people who don't look like you. It's embarrassing and it needs to stop." Mrs. Sullivan's face twisted in fury. "I'm protecting this neighborhood." "From what?" Mr. Thompson demanded, gesturing toward the delivery driver, then toward Fatima, who was still standing frozen in her garden. "From hardworking families? From kids playing outside? From people doing their jobs?" He shook his head, his voice sharp. "You're not protecting anyone. You're poisoning this place." Other neighbors began stepping outside now, murmuring in agreement. Mrs. Gupta stood near her porch, nodding firmly. "He's right. Enough is enough." "You don't speak for me," Mrs. Sullivan shouted, her voice cracking. "No," Mr. Thompson replied calmly. "But neither do you. And you don't get to decide who belongs here." Mrs. Sullivan looked around, her gaze darting from house to house, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But no one did. Instead, all she saw were faces filled with disappointment and quiet judgment. Finally, she turned and stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. The street fell silent for a long moment before Mr. Thompson turned to the delivery driver with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about that, son. She doesn't speak for the rest of us." The young man nodded, still looking slightly stunned. "It's all right. Thanks." Mr. Thompson glanced toward Fatima then, giving her a small nod. She returned it, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. The days that followed were quiet. Mrs. Sullivan stayed inside, her blinds drawn, as though hiding from the world she had once tried to control. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now went out of their way to greet Fatima and Ibrahim. One morning, as Fatima watered her garden, Mrs. Gupta walked over with a plate of freshly baked bread. "For you," she said with a warm smile. "I thought you might like some." Fatima accepted the plate gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Gupta. You didn't have to do this." "It's the least I can do," she replied. "I want you to know you're welcome here. We're glad to have you." Fatima blinked back tears, smiling through the lump in her throat. "That means more than you know." As Mrs. Gupta walked back to her house, Ibrahim stepped out onto the porch, watching the exchange. "Things are changing," he said quietly. Fatima nodded, her voice soft. "They are." She glanced toward Mrs. Sullivan's house, where the blinds were still closed. The woman's absence felt almost as loud as her presence had once been. Fatima didn't take pleasure in it, but she felt a quiet sense of justice. Hate had no place here. Not anymore. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the boys played in the front yard, their laughter carrying through the warm air. Fatima and Ibrahim sat together on the porch, watching them with quiet contentment. "This is what we fought for," Fatima said softly. "For them. For this?" Ibrahim smiled, his arm resting gently around her shoulders. "And we won't stop fighting. Not ever." Fatima looked up at the sky, the fading light casting a golden glow across the neighborhood. The roses in her garden swayed gently in the breeze, their blooms vibrant and alive. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. but it was home. And they weren't leaving. Not now. Not ever.